Welcome to Star Trek Story, Myth, and Arcs podcast. Its 5-year mission to explore Star Trek arcs and themes, seek out new story directions, and boldly tell stories that no one has told before.
Hailing frequencies open, sir.
All right, welcome to Star Trek Story, Myth, and Arcs. I have the honor of having one of my top 5 dream guests on this show, and he's not only the man who killed Captain Kirk, but at least he didn't turn Captain Kirk into a lizard who mated with the helmsman after going to warp 10. He did do that to another captain. So Brannon Braga is one of the most important writers of Star Trek over the last 25 years, because with Next Generation alone, his name is attached to more than 70 episodes. He was the showrunner in the back half of Star Trek Voyager and wrote 2 of the films and helped create Star Trek Enterprise. So we're going to talk about all that because that's what we do here on Star Trek Story, Myth, and Arcs. Brannon, welcome to my Star Trek podcast. We've already talked before, but we talked about Clive Barker. We got a little bit of Star Trek in, but we're going to assume that people did not hear that interview. So for those of you who do listen to both my podcasts, you may hear us repeat ourselves a little bit. So welcome.
Glad to be here, kind of.
I know we're talking about stuff you haven't done for a long time, and I know Star Trek is probably...
I mean kind of being here. Never mind.
Yes.
I'm happy to be doing this. I wish
Right.
I guess it would have been this way anyway,
Exactly. But, the funny thing about talking about your connection to Star Trek, and we did this already a little bit, but there's a reason why you in particular are one of my dream guests and the person that's so important to me as a Star Trek writer, because going back to my earliest times as a fan of fiction, I've always, when I first discovered the names in the credits written by Richard Matheson and then seeing his name on the spine of books, it taught me that a person is writing this and taught me to follow writers. And when I was watching Star Trek, there was a name who consistently kept coming up, yours, because he wrote all the weirdest episodes, and those were a lot of my favorites. So we're going to eventually talk about that and how you got to be known as one of the weirder voices in Star Trek. But that was one of the reasons why every time I saw your name pop up in the written by, I got excited because I thought, okay, here comes something strange. And you always delivered. So that's one of the things that I just wanted to get off my chest in the beginning. But
thank you.
How did you get to Star Trek? How did you end up there? Because Next Generation was one of your earliest jobs in the industry.
It was my first job. I had a very similar experience to yours with the Twilight Zone. And I bought this book by Mark Scott Zicree called The Twilight Zone Companion. And it was the first book of its kind that synopsized the episodes and then would give you some behind the scenes information about it and kind of break it down. And it was a great way to watch the Twilight Zone as a teenager in my room every single night. And I had a similar experience because there were writers, of course, Rod Serling, but there were other writers that I knew, like Richard Matheson, Charles Beaumont, who I knew it was going to be an extra good one if their names were on there. And it was my first dawning awareness of television writers as well. So I had a similar experience.
Well, and I had the Twilight Zone Companion too. And I kept track of the episodes that I watched by writing and marking off the certain ones that I saw. And that is also how I tracked the Richard Matheson episodes and the Beaumont episodes. And, because Beaumont, for example, and the cool thing too was once you discovered that they had these short stories out there that, like The Howling Man for Beaumont.
Yep.
And, actually reading like Nightmare at 20,000 feet. And you know, it was a lesson in you know, these are human beings that are out here
Yeah.
doing this. So did you want to get into the industry because of the Twilight Zone?
I think it was more movies that made, you know, I wanted to be a movie director and a movie. I mean, initially as a kid, I wanted to be an actor because I thought the actors were making up the lines. And then I found out what actors do and what a writer was. And it took me a while, but I really wanted, you know, I went to film school at UC Santa Cruz, which is a small but really good program at the time. It's grown quite a bit. And I just saw this Academy of TV Arts and Sciences was doing an internship program with something like 26 different internships in different fields of television: writing, directing, costume, casting, makeup. I mean, every category. And I saw a poster for it. I applied. I didn't get it. The next year, as I was leaving college, I applied again. I was a finalist. There were 2 interns for writing at that time. One was for a sitcom called Dear Doctor, and one was for Star Trek: The Next Generation. And I'm lucky that I got Next Generation, or I was picked by Michael Piller, who was running the show at that time. And that's how it started. You know, I didn't think of TV as an avenue. I wanted to make movies, and, you know, TV was kind of less than. But I found out really quick that TV was an amazing medium, and I'd been loving it all along with the Twilight Zone and the Andy Griffith Show and other shows that I loved and followed, because Andy Griffith Show is another show where I would follow the writers,
Mhm.
because I love that show. And I had an 8-week internship. I walked in, my first Best of Both Worlds Part 1 had just aired like a week earlier, days earlier. And I walked into Michael Pillar's office, and he was at his keyboard. And he said, "Any ideas on how to beat the Borg? Because I'm writing this second part right now." And I'm just, you know, like, not really. And that was, and I stayed, it was 17 years later that I left the building. I was the last one to turn the lights off. So
It's amazing to think that first question, any ideas to beat the Borg?
yeah, he was trying to figure it out. But that was my introduction to it. And
No, no, when I talked to Robert Hugh Wolf, we talked at length about Michael Piller as being like one of these people who was really great at identifying talent and putting people in the right place. And his contribution to Star Trek is really well known, but I also think his version of the Dead Zone was super underrated. And I give him credit for specifically honing in on what is my absolute favorite Stephen King novel, The Dead Zone, and seeing, because when I first heard he was making a TV show of it, I was like, I don't know how you could do that. And they did a great job. But what I want to get to with Michael Piller is his ability to harness and look for talent. I think is really underrated. He did this for Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, and Voyager, correct?
yeah, and Jerry Taylor.
Yeah.
You know, when I got to Next Gen, it was Michael Piller and Ron Moore.
Mhm.
And Ron and all the writing staff that was there was gone, had just departed for whatever reasons. And it was Ron, Michael, and the intern, me. And I watched these key hires happen: Jerry Taylor, Joe Manosky, Renee Echevarria, and eventually Narain Shankar, who was our science consultant. Like this core staff of Next Generation writers came together while I was an intern and then a staff writer. So Michael and Jerry Taylor, I got to give a lot of credit to her too, was, you know, great at nurturing writers. You know, she, in some ways, she had to convince Michael to hire me on some level. I don't know that he had total faith, even though I just done a good rewrite on an episode. My first script was called Reunion, which was the death of Kalar, Worf's girlfriend. And she was instrumental too in nurturing the talent.
And
but Michael, and I don't know that Michael necessarily intended to have a writing staff of people in their mid-20s. You know, that was a very young staff. He was always looking, you know, for more, trying to find another Jerry Taylor to come aboard. It just kind of happened that way.
Well, I think it was a smart call because I think, and look, the first 2 seasons of Next Generation are pretty rough to watch going back now. And I think part of the problem is that I think there needed to be a youth movement at Next Generation because I think, just there were really great writers that were involved, but there were people who had, like DC Fontana, for example, incredible talent, one of the most important writers in television history, let alone. But I think to invent something called the Next Generation, I think it's important to give another generation of writers a chance. And I think that season 3, and really as you guys progress with season 4, like the new feeling actually, even though it was the same characters, I think it had a new feeling as it was going forward. And that was great. And we will talk about Jerry Taylor more when we get to Voyager, because I have some specific questions there.
Yeah.
But as far as what was that like? I know you talked about how you approached it like an anthology show, but Reunion was your first time. You had to sit down and do a Klingon episode first off.
Well, I was lucky in that Michael, because I was at the end of my 8-week internship and he wanted to give me a shot, but he paired me with Ron Moore. Thank God. And we used to call Ron the Margaret Mead of the Klingons. I can't think of a more contemporary example, but so Ron and I sat in a room and wrote that script, did a page 1 rewrite of that. The idea of rewriting a script was new. I mean, there's so much new stuff for me going on. So I had Ron there, and that was a huge plus for me. But it was a good partnership, one that would continue intermittently. And yeah.
Yeah. And we'll in the process of this talk more about that partnership too. But so then once you got a chance to like actually get on the writing staff, what was the Next Generation writing room like at the time? Because I know writers' rooms were a little different then than how they kind of operate these days.
Well, not for me, because what I learned there, I took forward. I mean, the Orville writers' room is similar to what that writers' room was. I mean, writers' rooms do differ, but it was when I was there, it was basically Michael, Jerry Taylor, Joe Winoski, Ron Moore, and me. And we would sit and try to come up with story ideas. We would hear, I think Michael and Jerry would take pitches from outside writers, but generally speaking, once we had a story we knew we wanted to do, we would just sit in a room and break it out. The first story break I sat through was Family. Mm-hmm. The one where Picard goes with his, to meet his brother after his Borg experience. And it was like magic. I didn't know how they were thinking so quickly and how they were assembling these episodes. Like I just learned by observing and to some degree more and more participating. But it was, it's a lot of work. It's like I think of the episode Cause and Effect about the time loop. We sat for a long time trying to figure out how to get him out of that time loop. It's not like I figured it out all by myself. Like people would throw out suggestions, and we eventually came upon an idea, Data sending himself a message, but that was a tough one to figure out. And it took all those brains sitting in a room together, putting beats up on a dry erase board. I wish I'd taken more pictures, but there were no cell phone cameras at the time. You actually would have to get a camera, take pictures, and have the film developed.
Right. Well, and Family was an interesting one to sit and watch or be a part of for the first time, because it was one of the first times that Star Trek was really showing consequences for a storyline that had happened in a previous episode. And this, speaking of arcs and storytelling, you guys were really having to reckon with and think about what the Locutus and Borg experience would have been for Jean-Luc Picard. So that had to be an interesting one to sit through.
Oh, it also, it was, it all, it was also a testament to how diverse the show could be and its the types of stories it could tell.
Mhm.
And it's one of the things Seth MacFarlane talks a lot about in regards to Orville.
Mhm.
He, he really loved the way when you tuned in to Next Gen, you could be in a vineyard for an entire episode. Like that was kind of radical at the time. You never knew what story you were going to get. You might get a Western on the holodeck. You might get a Klingon political type drama. You might get some weird ass thing that I was doing, and that's how I had to approach it as somebody who didn't know Star Trek as well as, say, Ron Moore.
Mhm.
And though I had seen some Next Generation, because when I was leaving my final year of college, word on the street was that it was good. Because when it first came out, I remember sitting in my one bedroom apartment in West LA in 1987, when the Next Generation came on, and I watched the pilot and I watched the first couple episodes, and it just wasn't my cup of tea.
Right.
But then a couple years later, there's this talk that no, it's really good now. And that's just how word of mouth happens, And then I started watching it, some season 3 episodes. Little did I know I would end up there. But I had to approach the show as an anthology, with recurring characters, and that to understand it and I brought my Twilight Zone kind of sensibilities, and there was the room for different stories being told. Like it was never one thing. So I found my niche,
And so I'm
my
sure,
niche, whatever.
yeah, I'm sure there's always with every writer's room, but even back then there was probably, they teamed you and Ron together for because you guys had different strengths, and you're going to get episodes that play to your strengths that are more like anthology episodes. And that kind of works. But one of the cool things is that when you write as many episodes as you did, I'm sure you had to put yourself out of your comfort zone and write stuff that wasn't necessarily your niche all the time, and
Yeah.
that pushes your strength as a writer overall, I'd imagine,
Yeah.
right?
Yes, I was given, I remember, another rewrite called Imaginary Friend, not one of the shining moments of Next Generation, but it was a script that wasn't working, and I had to figure out how to make it work. And I didn't love it. I didn't love the idea of it exactly, but it was my first taste of what would come as a showrunner, where you're always taking a pass at things. And Michael had his hands full. We were doing 26 episodes a year. It's a lot of episodes of Star Trek.
Right. Well, and we're gonna get to all the different shows, and I definitely want to talk to you about the Orville as well. I have that last in my notes, but so the thing about these, when you're breaking episodes and you're new to writing and you're seeing this process, do you remember like a light bulb moment that where you saw maybe one of the other writers like fixing a problem that you still consider to this day like this was the light bulb moment that you refer to with younger writers when you're, for example, working at the Orville or whatever? Do you have one specifically from Next Gen?
No, nothing that I talk about, but there are moments that stuck with me. There was a moment, we were breaking a story. Was it Clues? The one where they get amnesia?
I'm not good with next gen titles.
We were
I
breaking
actually know Voyager and Deep Space Nine better than next gen.
So it was a story where the crew has amnesia, and we couldn't figure out what to do with the episode. And we were just about to abandon it when Joe Manosky said, "What if they think they're a warship? Because there's an alien on board who's posing as the crew member to make them think." And boom, the entire episode came into focus. And I just remember, like, wow, Joe saved the day. Like, that's what a writer does in the writer's room. I remember when we broke the story Darmok, and Michael Piller was a big fan of Dances with Wolves. In fact, took us all to go see it, and wanted to do a show about communication, about Picard and an alien who have to find a way to communicate because they don't speak the same language. And we broke out the story, but we didn't come up with what the language was. And I remember Joe writing this script with this alien species that spoke in mythic terms, metaphorical mythic terms, and he created this language that no one had ever thought of before. And I'm like, wow, that's what a writer does. Like, he brought it, man. Like, that script was solid gold.
And since next gen was your first experience, I'm wondering, and I'm sure you have experiences with all the different shows like this, but do you have a moment with next gen where it's a moment that you're most proud of for the way you solved something, or something when you were sitting at the keyboard and lightning struck with you? I know it's been a long time, but
You know, I think I didn't know it at the time, but like with episodes like Cause and Effect or parallels with the alternate realities that Worf is jumping around, and I didn't realize how kind of radical that storytelling was at the time. We just did this episode with the time loop, but there is a lot of anecdotes about people calling the TV station saying something's wrong with the TV, and that's a sign that something new is being done.
right.
And I'm proud that we did a lot of cool stuff like that on Next Generation, and without even really realizing that we were kind of pushing the boundaries of what story kinds of science fiction storytelling that you can do. I mean, I'm very proud of the finale, All Good Things, and the kind of time jumping aspect to it, of Picard kind of unstuck in time, which is a Slaughterhouse-5 type of convention. But it was such a beautiful convention because you could go back to see Data as he was in season 1 versus as he is now versus as he is in the future. So it's a real character piece in that regard. So I'm proud of that.
Now, you and Ron wrote that one together, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, you guys got the job to, and I wanted to next go to the movies, but I do think you're right to bring up the finale, because I think from a storytelling angle, the ability to end the show and bookmark, and to have an idea that bookmarks the whole series by taking you back to the beginning and doing the whole Q thing. That was all, you guys wrote the script, but it was all broken in the room with all the writers, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
And so you guys all had an idea that you were working towards this. Were you guys and what I thought was cool too is you guys fed into that episode with the last couple before it, with a couple stories that kind of really set it up. What were the particular challenges of writing that finale, and how did you guys as a team support each other and finishing that script?
Well, I don't know how we ended up with the finale. I think Michael Piller was so busy with Deep Space Nine. And we were also chosen to write the movie, the the first Next Gen movie. So I mean, it's well known in Star Trek land that we were writing the finale and the movie at the same time. So we were ending one thing and starting another. Look, it's we would just sit in a room and work half the day on one thing and half the day on another. And I'd be at the keyboard. Ron would pace around. Ron's a genius at dialogue. I probably was providing different I'm more a conceptual guy. I remember coming up with the idea of anti-time, sitting at the keyboard because that wasn't in the story break. I mean, it's just, and it's hard to say who came up with what or who wrote what between Ron and I. It was a long time ago, and it was all a blur even at the time. But we were just set loose on the finale, whereas the Generations had a lot of cooks and a lot of mandates. Whereas we just, I don't know, it's a miracle that it all came together.
Right. And I know part of the challenges of Generations was that, the original series cast, some members were in, some were out. They were kind of pulling in and out at times. So you had to probably change the script 100 times based on, I know Leonard Nimoy was in at one point and then out. And so you guys had to deal with those challenges. But one of the things, I think the best scene, or the one that just blows everyone away in Generations, is when you destroy the Enterprise D. But it was my understanding that you guys had wanted to do that a couple seasons back, but it was too expensive. Was it something you guys were holding on to for that, or?
No, I don't remember well enough to say that we wanted to blow up the ship when the series was on. I don't think that was ever seriously considered, as far as I recall. I mean,
that's the rumor, but of course,
I don't.
You would know better than me.
I think it was discussed from time to time. Separating the saucer was always a deal, but no, it didn't. I don't think it was something that we wanted to do that got shot down or anything like that. I mean, we could find ways to blow up the ship without actually blowing it up, I'm glad it was done in the movie, because it was done better than we ever could have afforded.
Mm-hmm. So you guys were writing the finale and this movie at the same time. That's a pretty interesting challenge as well.
I was in my 20s. I had a lot more energy. I had nothing else to do.
Right. Well, and I think, of course, you guys sat in a room and knew that you had to write the scene that killed Captain Kirk. I'm sure that weighed a little bit more heavily on Ron, being the serious Star Trek nerd that he was.
Well,
but you guys probably thought a lot about doing that.
I mean, but in all fairness, by the time we were getting into the killing the Kirk scene, at that point we were done with the TV show. It was a much longer process with the movie script. It's a whole different kind of experience. But Ron, it was Ron. I remember, I think we just kind of flew to Maui in Hawaii to just lock ourselves in a room and write, do another draft of that script. And when it came time to killing Kirk, Ron was very, he's had a tear in his eye. He was moved by it, because this had been one of his icons growing up, and we didn't take it lightly.
No, I'm sure you didn't. And the, I think one of the most interesting elements of Generations is that, you had to combine the timelines. You had to figure out a way to do that. Did you guys break down the movie with others, or did you guys work on that alone? Because it's a different animal writing a film script than it is writing it for a TV show.
We figured out the story with Rick Berman, and then there was no writing staff. so Ron and I, we didn't really have, as I recall, like a specific an outline. We just kind of went off and wrote it, and then got notes and more notes, and until we had a draft that we were happy enough with to give to the studio. But we had Rick Berman notes, William Shatner, Patrick Stewart, the director David Carson, the studio Paramount, Brent Spiner, everybody, all the major players had things they wanted to accomplish in this movie. So it was a different experience, and we'd never written a movie before. It was a little intimidating. It wasn't the same as the TV show. It had to be bigger. It had to have broader moves. Data gets an emotion chip. We would never do that on the show. It would change the character too much. But in a movie, you need those bolder strokes. And we knew it was a risk, and I wish we'd done more with it. In First Contact, we did do more with it. So I'm glad we set it up as a vulnerability for the Borg Queen to exploit. I thought was a great move in First Contact. So it was much more fun writing the finale than it was the movie. The movie was a little more stressful.
I'm sure.
And with that, I'm going to use the bathroom real quick.
Okay. All right. So, then you guys, I don't know if you went to work on the other shows before working on First Contact, or did you jump right into First Contact?
Generations came out, was very successful, and it was very quick that they wanted a sequel, and it felt fairly continuous. And at that point, Ron was on Deep Space Nine, and I was on to Voyager.
Right. So you guys were still doing TV work at the same time. You didn't
always
break from that. Okay.
Always.
Yeah. Well, in First Contact, it always seemed to me that, and I don't know how much you guys were paying attention to the rhythm of the films, but First Contact felt like your Rathacon in many ways. And Rathacon is my #1 comfort movie. If I'm sick, I put on Rathacon. I just, Rathacon.
It's the best one.
Yeah, I can watch Rathacon pretty much like anytime. I know every line, and it doesn't matter. I still love it. And what I remember about my joy in watching First Contact as a Star Trek fan at the time was, I remember halfway through the movie turning to my girlfriend at the time and saying, "It's their Rathacon. It's totally their Rathacon."
Yeah.
And that's one of my memories on that. And that's specifically because you're paying off that arc for Picard with the Borg. So from the beginning, you guys, I'm assuming it was always the Borg for the second one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh. Yeah. The Borg hadn't really been touched in a meaningful way since Best of Both Worlds. And we just felt like they were a big screen villain, and we could do them with a bigger budget. We could do them better. And there was never question that the Borg were going to be the villain, and that Picard would have a reckoning as a former Borg. And we knew we wanted time travel. We knew we wanted the Borg to violate the timeline. And there was some discussion about when that would take place. Would it be the Middle Ages? Would it be, that was discussed. Patrick vehemently refused to wear tights. He says, I won't. I mean, he just was not into that. We talked about it being kind of a near future from today, which is kind of where we landed. But where we ended up was what I would always call, the birth of Star Trek, and the three wise Vulcans, and the Star Trek nativity scene. It was.
And what's wonderful is that Star Trek fans celebrate First Contact Day. Does that mess with you? With you guys?
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I could never have foreseen that, but I love it. I mean, look, it was just a great, and I personally was always fascinated with the idea that you could go back in time and suddenly it would smell different, or maybe your hero is an asshole. Like Zephram Cochrane invented warp drive for money. Like he, not the reasons they thought that history thought he did. And I just felt that that was really interesting, and that we could invite non-Star Trek fans into the Star Trek universe by showing how it all came to be and what it means. And that it's funny how certain things go on in Star Trek fandom to become famous lines. For instance, the line must be drawn here, this far, no further. I think it's a grammatical error. I don't think he says farther. Maybe he does. That line, that's a famous line. But also Picard's speech to the Lily character about there's no money where I come from. And what that speech is, I see referred to quite often.
A lot.
And because it's encapsulating an ethos about what Gene Roddenberry invented. And the film was wildly successful at the box office because it broke, like Khan, it went mainstream. It wasn't just Star Trek fans. It was people who didn't know Star Trek heard it was good and they were going to see it.
Well, I think one of the reasons why First Contact is a little bit better than, well, it's better than Generations and work better and work better with the mainstream is because you guys nailed in First Contact the idea that well, like one of the things that works about Star Trek 4 and 2, and I think Search for Spock for a lesser degree, but I think all of them work really well because it gets the character, the humor, it has the funny moments. Everyone has a role to play, and all those elements are what make the best Star Trek movies. Is those boxes, and First Contact is just really nails all those things, and I think that's one of the reasons why it's a great piece of writing. And
it was where it's where I came up with the notion, which is I'm sure not a new one, fun to write, fun to watch. Because First Contact was fun to write. Generations was less fun. And I realized that that translates.
For sure. And I think well, and I personally, and I think Pillar wrote Insurrection, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think Insurrection is underrated for hitting all those elements as well. It didn't have like the mass appeal I think that the Borg created, because one of the things that made First Contact work is you had the humor, you had all the characters, you had all that fun stuff, but it was also in part a horror movie because the Borg elements were terrifying. So, and for people who were new to Star Trek, then you can say like, wow, this could be really scary, you know?
Yeah.
And
sure.
so I think that was one of the reasons why First Contact worked so well. But and I love that that First Contact Day is a thing that people celebrate. And
well, we could all use, I think, where are the Vulcans? Like we could use them right about now.
Yes, we could. We totally could. All right, so you ended up inheriting Catherine Janeway in the Delta Quadrant. And one of the things that, and you brought up Jerry Taylor earlier, and I just have to acknowledge for a moment that Jerry Taylor went to college in my hometown of Bloomington, Indiana, which means that I share a hometown with Catherine Janeway.
Right.
And I have interviewed the people who organized the statue and put the statue up in Bloomington. So Peter and Mary Beth, shout out to you guys because that is amazing. And one of the things that made me really excited and about the way my hometown honored Catherine Janeway is that if you watch the ceremony, not only did they involve Kate Mulgrew, but there was a huge part of the ceremony that honored Jerry Taylor, because she was so fundamental in creating the character of Catherine Janeway, but also gave her that hometown that was paying it back. So we know that Bloomington played a role in Catherine Janeway.
That's right.
I want to put that out there.
Yeah, that's all Jerry.
Yeah. And so Jerry played such a huge role, and like it was so important to create a female captain, but you inherited all those story elements because you weren't on Voyager when they created the storyline about being in the Delta Quadrant and the captains and all the characters. So what was it like coming into that show with those things established?
I'd experienced it with Next Gen. I was glad. At one point, Michael Piller wanted me to go to Deep Space Nine. I think between season 6 and 7 of Next Gen, he invited me to join that writing staff. And I thought about it, and it was exciting because it was a new premise and new characters, but I really wanted to finish Next Generation. I wanted to see it through, and I'm glad I did. And I'm glad as well because I got to work on Voyager. And what I liked about Voyager was the concept that they were somewhere new, that we weren't going to be in any way relying on Klingons or any of the usual suspects, and that it could be a very scary place. And on the other hand, you got to come up with cool stuff and fulfill that promise. I was thrilled at Captain Janeway and the casting of Kate Mulgrew, and though we started writing before we cast, I think I wrote maybe 2 or 3 Voyager scripts before we cast a single person. And I wasn't that interested, as just me personally, that interested in the Maquis stuff, the political stuff. I felt like once you're lost on a desert island, if you're an American and you're trapped with an ISIS guy, how long are you going to argue before you have to find food? And you actually need each other to survive. So the things I liked about it, there were things I was a little ambivalent about, but it was exciting. There was a moment in time when Generations was coming out. We were on the cover of Time. Kirk and Picard were on the cover of Time magazine, back when magazines were a thing, and being on the cover of Time was a thing. The movie was coming out. You had Deep Space Nine. We had Voyager was being invented, and I mean, Star Trek was at its apex, and I don't think it ever. I think it continued to do amazing stories, and from that point forward, but it never, really. I don't want to say it was downhill from there, but it's hard to sustain that peak. And I was lucky to be there when I think Best of Both Worlds was a turning point, and where it started to become more and more and more popular. So it was interesting. I never thought there'd be a First Contact Day, a statue of Janeway, or any of the other things that we'd be talking about it 30 years later.
Right. Yeah, and it's really one of the things that's neat about like the statue of Janeway. My stepmother doesn't watch Star Trek, doesn't know anything about Star Trek, but she's sending me text messages saying, "Can you explain to me who this Catherine Janeway is?" Because she's like, saw the statue and was like, "Oh, it's Star Trek. Well, David will know." Explain this to me. And it's just amazing to me that she was walking in Bloomington and just was walking on, because there's a trail that goes past the statue is right outside a science museum for kids called Wonder Lab. and they put the statue up there, but it's also a trail goes right past it. So it's an amazing spot. And I just couldn't be prouder of my hometown that that we
That's
did
great.
this. And I'll never forget because I remember the first time that it's mentioned that she's from Bloomington was in an episode where she goes back or in some way having like a holodeck or something about Indiana. And I remember like I got, because this was early internet, I got all these emails from friends saying, "Did you notice that Janeway's from your hometown?" And I'm like, "Yes, I'm aware. It's very cool." And I always loved that. Now, some of the things that you did with Voyager, I mean, it's funny when we were talking about people celebrating First Contact Day. I saw there's a somebody posted on Twitter, they got a threshold tattoo of the Janeway Paris lizards. They got a tattoo of
Are
that.
they that's insane.
Well, what's funny about Threshold, and this is an episode you wrote, is that this is one of the most debated episodes of Voyager because half people think it's so batshit crazy that it's great, and then another people are like, "No, just I don't want to go there," like because they just cannot get around the idea of what happens at the end. Um, how do you? I gotta ask you about writing Threshold. I have to. What were you thinking writing that episode?
Well, first of all, we never set out to do a bad episode.
Right.
We always have high aspirations. Doing 26 per season, which means churning a script out every 10 days, is brutal, particularly when every Star Trek episode, you want to make it great, but they're standalone episodes. What's the concept next week?
Right.
And when it's working on all, when it's got a great concept with some kind of character aspect to it, and maybe even some cool themes, it's a classic. But then there are those that don't work. And Threshold came about because I'm a huge David Cronenberg fan, and I thought his version of The Fly was an amazing movie, and I was always interested in body horror and transmorgification, and I wondered if you went warp 10, what might happen to you? Something strange might happen, and it has echoes of The Fly galore. I mean, his tongue falls out or something. I mean, he's transmuting. He's becoming something else. And I actually was interested in the concept that evolution by natural selection doesn't necessarily mean you're evolving to a higher. It's random. It's blind and drunk. You may end up going backward. Unfortunately, I literalized that by turning them into amphibians. I think if I hadn't done that ending, it would be considered a better episode. It's just outrageous. It's so implausible. But then if you think of an episode on Next Gen like Genesis,
Yeah.
where people are de-evolving, people had no issue with Troy becoming an amphibian. But she didn't become an amphibian. She just developed gill slits and nictitating membranes. So I took it too far.
I don't know because
I'd have to watch it again. I mean, it's considered kind of like Spock's brain bad.
I would never say that about Threshold. However, it's interesting you should mention Cronenberg today. I don't know if you heard, but he has a cameo in today's Discovery that came out. He actually,
oh, really?
Yeah, he, and it's funny because when I saw him, I was like, God, that guy looks like David Cronenberg. And then in my brain, I went, they filmed this in Toronto, and the scene was with Michelle Yeoh, and I know that they were jurors together for Khan. So I was like, that's David Cronenberg. And the second he opened his mouth, I was like, wow.
By the way,
Werner Herzog, I'm telling you, the Orville might need to get Guillermo del Toro or somebody.
wait, was Werner Herzog on Discovery?
No, he was on The Mandalorian. So I'm saying,
Oh, you know, yeah, we've got a couple good cameos this in season 3.
awesome.
We got some good stuff.
Well,
Uh,
we'll get to the Orville, but my favorite Voyager is Timeless. That is one of my absolute favorite episodes of Voyager, and so we talked about Threshold, but now I want to talk about one that I think, and I am a defender of Threshold. I'm one of those people, but Timeless, I think, was just an absolutely brilliant arc where again you played with time travel and the what if of what could have happened. It's absolutely a heartbreaking episode. Very good. It's one of my favorites. But I don't really have a question. I just I just want to put it out there
yeah,
that
well, thanks. I mean, that's one of those situations that worked out. It was the 100th episode of Voyager. I wanted to do something special, and I just had the image of Voyager under ice. And I'm like, what does that mean? If you
that's where it started.
start you start the 100th episode with Voyager inside a glacier, completely unexpected, and the story started from there. And Joe Manosky and I wrote it together. You know, but it worked. You know, there it turned out to be a good episode. We also spent some extra cash with the crash landing of Voyager, but you know, it could have worked out to be a terrible episode. It's just it's you never set out to make a bad one.
Right.
You know, rarely did we go in a situation where like this script is terrible. We're making a bad episode. It doesn't happen that way.
Now, and I just recently watched a commentary video by a Star Trek fan with autism talking about all the different neurodiversity that Star Trek displayed, starting with Spock. But one of the things that was really interesting to me is that I had never thought of Seven of Nine as being a character with autism. But she made this person who made the video, she goes by Jessie Gender on Twitter. She made a compelling argument that Seven of Nine with her social awkwardism, you know, just like, and whatever, she may not have been born with autism, but she was basically given it by having been turned Borg. I wonder, going back, because obviously everyone believes that the network told you like to write a character like Seven of Nine, which is funny, but I think what they didn't know was that you guys were going to do such an amazing job of making a character who was so interesting because you took the Locutus of Borg situation and put it onto a character who's a regular on the crew. And I think that was such a brilliant move.
By the way, Joe Manosky's texting me right now.
That's funny.
Yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. But yeah, so Seven of Nine as a character, like, I mean, I'm sure you were told to, you know, put a woman in a cat suit or whatever by the network. But what you guys did with this character was make her fascinating and interesting.
I mean, what happened was, I was home one night alone, and I was watching an episode that was airing, and there was some episode that ended with the crew finding the remnants of a Borg skeleton or something. And I remember thinking, oh, cool, the Borg. And every time the Borg even whispered about, there would be excitement. And I thought, well, what if next season, this was season 3 that I was thinking about this, we introduced a Borg character on the show, and we give Voyager the Borg as their recurring villain. That's where that idea for that character started. No one gave a mandate. I called Joe Manosky, talked about it, called Rick Berman that night. Rick suggested making it a female and maybe a striking kind of icy female, like Grace Kelly type. And it went from there. And we were the ones that took it to the network. They didn't.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, no, this was not a mandate. This was a midnight inspiration.
You know, it's funny because you're you have a chance to kind of undo that myth, because everyone has believed that for
No,
forever.
no, no, no. I had the idea late one night about the Borg character. Rick had the idea of making her a female, and it went from there. That's how that came about. And in fact, when the role was written and cast, and you have to credit Jerry Ryan with the success of the character, because she played it. I mean, I don't know how she pulled it off. It's one of those things where you feel so much emotion from this character who has no emotions on the surface. And I love the phrase neurodiversity. It's such a very interesting way to describe the Seven of Nines and the Spocks and the Datas and the characters that are most popular are the ones that don't fit in, are the ones that think differently and speak differently. But in fact, when they started promoting the Seven of Nine character, and they were really leaning into the cat suit of it all, and there were posters in LA with this statuesque Jerry Ryan, and we started getting criticism before an episode even aired with her of, oh, you're putting TNA on the show, sellouts. And it made me really angry, because I knew that this was a great character and Jerry Ryan was playing it beautifully. Watch the show. You'll see. This isn't some tasteless ploy to get viewers. It is, in that we wanted to introduce something new to the show and attract attention. But it really upset me that this was going on. And there was this judgment, which in itself was kind of sexist, honestly. And I think once Jerry came on camera, that all went out the window.
And I agree, and I think that some of the best storylines, very inspired to put her with the Doctor, with some of those episodes, just them both being kind of fish out of water, just super brilliant, and how that came to be. Now with Enterprise, you had the chance to create your own show from the ground up, and that was your first time doing that. How much was that a very freeing feeling for you,
It was
or more daunting?
very daunting, but it was with Rick, who by that point was had become a good friend, and I really was looking forward to working with him as a writer, because Rick's quite a good writer, and he gave notes on every episode, and his notes were very detailed down to words, like, and he made, as far as I was concerned, he made scripts better. He made them more concise.
Was that with all the shows that he would give notes? Like,
every script of every show.
wow.
We would sit and pour over everything, which a process I enjoyed. I'm not sure all the writers did, but I thought it was really enlightening, and I enjoyed working with Rick, and him inviting me to create a show was great. I know that he wanted to wait a year or two to put another Star Trek on. The studio did not, and I wasn't involved in those discussions, but I suspect it was kind of like, well, if you don't do it, we'll find someone who will do it. And he had this idea of a prequel. And I really liked the idea of doing something where people were a little closer to us than they are to Picard, and it would have a little bit of a different feeling to it. People could wear tennis shoes and ball caps, and there could be a dog, and there could be a little more contemporary. And the idea of doing a prequel was a relatively new idea at the time. Star Wars had done it, and I was excited. It was fun to do, and I enjoyed working on the show. By that point, we were, people were starting to turn on Star Trek a little bit. I felt like, oh, another one. It's too similar to the others. What are you doing to the Vulcans? those aren't Vulcans. And I'm like, no, they're not Vulcans like you know them. They're Vulcans 100 years ago. I mean, cultures change. Humans changed them. They changed each other. I loved the idea that what happened after first contact? They became our babysitters. Like they were wary of us. We had invented warp drive. I just thought it was a great invention. I loved it. But some fans, I think, really hated that, which I never understood. I mean, do you just want normal Vulcans again? It's like you do something new and they get mad. You do something similar and they get mad. It's hard. It's really hard to satisfy. And we talked about this with Books of Blood. Clive Barker is different things to different people because his writing is so diverse. Same with Star Trek. It was really hard to satisfy everybody with what we were doing.
Well, and Star Wars went through that with The Last Jedi, and I think they learned all the wrong.
With the Rian Johnson one.
Yes, which I personally think is brilliant. And
yeah, I like that movie. What was wrong with that? What's wrong with that movie?
Well, the fans turned on it.
Why?
So much so that J.J. Abrams basically went the exact opposite direction with the next one and undid all, like, for example, the idea that Rey came from no one, right? And that she wasn't in the bloodline was like a great thing. Well, then they course corrected because the fans didn't like that and made her the Emperor's granddaughter, which, okay, you know.
I will say this. Ever since Darth Vader told Luke that he was his father, there's been this weird obsession with lineage. Who cares? It was good that once, but I don't care if Luke's Leia's brother, and I don't care whose granddaughter is this. And they're like, it's like it's a novelty I never really understood. At least her being from nowhere was kind of interesting.
Well, I think what you're talking about with Enterprise is the thing that fans are trying to grapple with Last Jedi. I loved Last Jedi because it said it doesn't matter what your bloodline is. You know, it doesn't matter where you come from. You come from nothing. It doesn't matter. You're a part of this story. And that was hard for some Star Wars fans to accept. And there were things that were hard for some Star Trek fans to accept about Enterprise. And I should be upfront with my relationship with Enterprise because I was one of those people that didn't get it initially. Okay. And I still will hold to that. I think season 1 of Enterprise is great. And season 3 of Enterprise is one of the best seasons of Star Trek, bar none. I get a little antsy with some of season 2, and I think season 4 is a mess. I'm just being honest.
Oh, interesting. Because a lot of fans think season 4 is the best season.
And I'm not one of them. I think season 3 is. And my relationship was, too, that I had a lot going on in my life, activist-wise, when season 2 came out. And it was the only time that I ever tapped out on a Star Trek series.
Yeah. By the way, after how many fucking years? I mean,
yeah,
good for you. You have to. You know?
Well, but what happened was, and I do want to tell you this story, is that years later, I was at a convention for Bizarro writers, BizarroCon in Portland. And I'm dying to get this guy on my Star Trek podcast because I know this, one of the editors at the publishing house where I published a lot of my books, and one of the guys who publishes there is this author, Carlton Mellick III. And Carlton is known for writing books like Baby Jesus Butt Plug and The Haunted Vagina and all these insane books. That's what he does. But he's also a Star Trek fan. And he and I were outside talking about, because he and I, when we'd hang out, a lot of times we would talk about Star Trek rather than what other things. And at one point he said to me something about, well, of course you love season 3 of Enterprise. And I said, Carlton, I got to admit to you, I tapped out after season 2. And he said, oh, no, David, go back and watch season 3 of Enterprise. You will love season 3 of Enterprise. And so I was like, well, if I'm going to go back and watch it, I have to go back and watch it from the beginning. Right. And the thing that struck me that I was like, I was not ready for when I watched Star Trek Enterprise the first time was there's one scene that just epitomizes why I love Enterprise. There's a scene in one of the first couple episodes where they're on another planet and they look for our star from the ground. And that anchored me to the Star Trek universe in a way that that if I was writing Star Trek, I would be looking for those moments all the time to anchor like this universe is real and we're in it.
Yeah.
And wow, look, that's our home star. And it got me emotional when I was watching it. And I was like, okay, I'm in for this show. Then I started to like the characters more the second time. And then when I got to season 3, which, and I know the rumor is that you guys had wanted to do a whole season on Voyager of Year of Hell, that it became a two-parter, but you guys had.
That's true.
Is that true?
Yeah, that's true.
Okay.
But it was, I never thought it was going to actually get approved, but it was worth a shot.
Yeah, well, Year of Hell would have made an amazing season of Voyager, but it seems like you got a chance to kind of do that with season 3 of Enterprise.
Yeah, we did.
And the entire arc and the Xindi storyline, you've got your various alien species, you've got your one storyline, you've got them going through hell, you have Jonathan Archer pushed to the limits where he's making decisions no one should ever make. And I don't know if you were, I think you were doing this a few years before Ron did BSG. But when I went back and watched season 3 of Enterprise, I said to myself, wow, this is definitely one of the best seasons of Star Trek, bar none. And I still think that today.
That's amazing. And I appreciate that. And, it's ironic that I would go on to write for 24 because it was 24 that opened the door to season 3. Serialized storytelling in primetime television was not a thing,
Right.
and certainly was not for Star Trek. But we wanted to do something to shake things up, and we got the studio's approval to do a seasonal arc, and it was something radically new for us. And it was, again, it's one of those fun to write, fun to watch things. Season 3, once we had this arc to hook into it, and you weren't just pounding your head to come up with new concepts every week, you could build on this concept, and we had it all figured out ahead of time in terms of the broad strokes, and it was just it really worked.
Well, and Deep Space Nine obviously did some of that.
Yeah, that's true. In all fairness, that's true. Yes.
Right. And Robert Hewitt Wolf told me when I interviewed him that he thought the fact that Voyager was so important to the network and they were kind of left alone a little bit compared to, because they weren't on UPN and they were still in the syndication, was one of the reasons why he thought that they got away with some things. And
yeah. I don't know.
Well, that was his theory, but
not a bad theory. Not a bad theory.
Yeah, and so it's funny too because I know Brian Fuller tells the famous story about, or one of his things I read in an interview was that that the difference between the hallways is that they were able to let their geek flag fly because they had the Alpha Quadrant, and you guys had to come up with new stuff, and you couldn't just be like, let's do a Ferengi episode, and that forced you guys to be more creative. But now with Enterprise, you're back in it, but the best season of it is when you created this whole other conflict and geniusly reacting to 9/11, in my opinion.
Yeah. The attack on Earth, the Xindi attack on Earth was definitely designed to evoke, the homeland. And by the way, it's also worth noting, it's one of the only times in the history of Star Trek television that Earth was at stake. Because we're very studious about that, in that you can't just put Earth at stake all the time. It loses all impact.
Mm-hmm.
So for a movie like First Contact, okay, they're gonna assimilate Earth. Best of Both Worlds, yes, that's one of the reasons that thing had just giganticness about it. Like Earth, they were gonna get Earth, and it was a long time before we turned our sights on Earth again, when the Xindi attacked. And
Yeah, Deep Space Nine only did it once with
Yeah.
the Dominion infiltrating Starfleet headquarters and all that. But so yeah, Earth did not get that a lot, and it's been a long time since I watched season 3 of Enterprise, and maybe I'm due to watch it again. But I cannot tell you enough that was it was my friend telling me like, hey, like, no, you'll love this. Right. But I also tell people that it's ahead of its time because for another reason too, which is that Jonathan Archer being pushed to the level that he was and making decisions that he was a lot of the tension that made Battlestar Galactica reboot work so well, because Ron was freed up from the Gene Roddenberry conceptions, and then got to do that. But I think you guys being before the Federation had really formed, that also gave you a little bit of freedom that you didn't have writing a show that took place.
But you also, it was an extreme situation for the captain, who was kind of this, when he starts out, he's kind of innocent. He's like a Boy Scout. I mean, he has no idea what he's getting into. And the Vulcans warn him, like, you don't know, you don't really know. You're not, you're not galaxy wise yet. And it was a great arc for him.
I always use the examples of season 3 of Enterprise and Battlestar Galactica reboot as showing the two partners that you guys were as a writing, like how much you guys had learned from all the earlier work that you were doing, which what I thought was just incredible arcs that show the growth that you had as writers from the early days to that.
And that's the thing that was kind of heartbreaking to me about Enterprise, and the struggles to get people to watch it and appreciate it, was the same people that made Next Gen were making it. Mm-hmm. And these weren't people who were tired and out of ideas. These were people like myself who brought everything to bear that they'd learned to make something great and push Star Trek into new territory. And I'm proud of the show, and I'm happy to hear that you liked season 3. And it's weird. I was doing an interview for Books of Blood, and I wish I could remember the guy's name and what website he wrote for, but he didn't want to talk about Books of Blood. He had just watched all of Enterprise, and it's all he wanted to talk about. He's like, he just thought it was the greatest. He'd never seen Star Trek before. He'd only seen Enterprise, and he was just crazy in love with it. And it's like there are, and it's funny, if you go to a Star Trek convention in England, there are a lot of Enterprise costumes, probably more than any other. Like it was really popular there. So there are, I think people are. I work with a guy named Joe Micucci, whose dad is a rabid Star Trek fan, and he's a rabid Star Trek fan of Voyager. That's his show. And Next Generation, because his Next Generation was his dad's show. And he'd never even watched Enterprise. He'd never seen a single episode. And I'm like, dude, you've got 99 episodes of Star Trek made by the same guys that made the things you love, sitting right there to watch.
Right. Yeah. I know it's hard. It's hard because, in retrospect, it took a friend telling me like, hey, season 3 is so up your alley. You gotta check it out.
It's kind of like, but you gotta, realize at that point how much Star Trek had been served up. It was, the Golden Goose was.
Yeah, it needed a break. I think it needed a break.
It needed a break, and it got a break, and then J.J. Abrams came in and refreshed the whole thing.
For better or for worse, I like
I thought that first movie was pretty great.
The first movie is pretty great. I have major problems with Into Darkness, and I actually like Star Trek Beyond. A lot of people don't, but I just have problems with Into Darkness. I know it's a Star Trek nerd thing, but I just can't get over the Enterprise being under the water for any reason, and beaming from Earth to Kronos should never happen. But that's beyond that. That's me Trek nerding. Now, so I've taken a lot of your
I think
time.
it also suffered from dipping more than its toe into sacred territory with Wrath of Khan.
Yes.
Like, you, in some ways, I would say you can't leave that one alone because it's still active.
Yes, I can see that. Now, I've taken a lot of your time, and I do want to talk about the Orville and what you're working on now, because I love the Orville, and I think it's a really great show. And we talked about it briefly in my Books of Blood interview, um, but the thing about the Orville is that there has been some of this ridiculous fan controversy over, pitting the Orville versus modern Star Trek. And, you briefly mentioned this in the other interview, but there's room for everybody. And I think more science fiction is a great thing, and more space opera is an awesome thing. And I like having Star Trek Discovery and the Orville at the same time. But how did the Orville come to you? And, Seth obviously is a big Star Trek fan, and he probably had this idea for a while, but how did it come to you?
Well, Seth and I met through Star Trek. I met Seth. I was doing Enterprise, so it was probably about 20 years ago. And we always talked about doing a Star Trek series. Seth he's a huge Star Trek fan, and particularly I think of Next Gen. And it just was not in the cards necessarily that Star Trek was. I think Star Trek was kind of dormant at the time, and they were focused on the movies. But he just called me one day and he's like, I have an idea for a show set on a spaceship, and he pitched it to me, and we talked about it, and he wrote his pilot script and got it set up at Fox, and we just kind of went from there. And I was nervous. I mean, I hadn't written this kind of storytelling in a while, and I was nervous. A, could I still do it? And B, would I still be, because I did it for so long. Did I still have passion for it? And the show was purposely kind of had a next gen ethos to it. I think the reason that some people think it's more Star Trek than Star Trek is because it is kind of Star Trek in its optimism. And whereas some of the modern Star Trek is exploring darker themes, which is okay. We just talked about season 3 of Enterprise. Very, very dark. Like, Trek can go many places. But once we got in a room and we started breaking stories, I'm just like, God, I missed this. I missed this so much. I love this. Mm-hmm. And it's just been a work of passion for Seth and myself. And season 3 is off the charts good.
Is it already written?
All written. All the scripts are written ahead of time.
Okay.
Which is how you can do when you're doing 13 episodes or 11 episodes. It's a little harder with 26. But all the scripts are written. It's a great season. The show is better than it's ever been. And I can't wait for people to see it. on Hulu when it comes out next year.
Yeah, and it's amazing that, you know, I admit I'm one of those people that when they first said like, um, the guy behind Family Guy has got this show, I was like, all right, well, I'm ready to be convinced. And when I saw your name attached, I immediately was like, I'm in. Okay, he's hiring the right people. And then I saw that some of the other Star Trek people came and were involved, and I thought that was obviously a really excellent choice. My wife is tempting me with vegan pizza over here, so uh, so but anyways, that threw me off. Now, but you got the same science consultants and people involved, and I think that really helped the fans to feel comfortable, like we're back, even though it's a totally different universe. That's why I think people feel comfortable with the Orville, and obviously that was intentional.
Yeah, it was. I think one of the things that was frustrating to Seth was the way the show was being marketed as, almost like a Galaxy Quest type thing, a satire, a loving satire. And I love Galaxy Quest, but it's not what Orville is. And we wondered if the fans were going to accept this mixture of science fiction drama with the comedy frosting, because it's not the other way around.
Mm.
These should, and that's why in the first season, for those who know the show, there was this episode called About a Girl, about a forcible gender reassignment and this Moclan race. And it was an episode that was later in the season, and we pulled it up to episode 3 because we thought, first of all, it's a great episode. And secondly, this is really what the show is. And people need to see this episode, and the critics need to see this episode. And
Agreed. It's amazing.
and will this be accepted? And the critics weren't so kind initially, but the fans got it, and they accepted it. And what was really surprising to me was how they reacted to the comedy. It wasn't broad to a lot of people. The comedy's not broad. These are just more people like you and me. These are more. This is what people would do and say if they were really out there, So anyway. It's a long way of saying Orville is a unique show with some. But I think one of the things that's incredibly important about it is its optimism about the future and our place in it.
Well, and I should be clear about this. Like, before I say this, is I wasn't a big fan of Lower Decks, because for
the episode or the
no, the new series, the new animated series.
I haven't seen it.
Yeah, and so the thing with Lower Decks is that it has the animation intensity where everyone seems like they're yelling all the time, and it's very funny. And I watched all the episodes because it's Star Trek, and I wanted to see what they were doing. There's some elements of it that are very, very funny. But the reason why I think the Orville works, whereas Lower Decks didn't work for me, is that the Orville, like you said, it's comedy frosting, right? But it feels like a universe I'm comfortable in. It doesn't feel forced or hammy or whatever. And I think that's one of the reasons why the Orville works, because the comedy, when it happens, can be absolutely hilarious and ridiculous. And by the way, casting Norm Macdonald as the voice of the slime mold was genius. And there's all kinds of elements like that. I mean, like, yes, you have a slime mold character who has a crush on the Doctor, and so yes, there's very funny things, but I think it's done tactfully, and that's one of the reasons why I think the Orville works. Whereas what the thing with Lower Decks for me is that it doesn't feel like Star Trek, because like people don't yell on Star Trek all the time. They're not like, "What are you doing?" like all the time. And in the animation, that they're constantly doing that.
Well, it's our Seth's approach to the Orville, which I think is kind of similar on Family Guy too, is story first.
Mm-hmm.
He would say to me, the best Family Guy episodes are the best episodes because they have good stories.
Right.
And when we're breaking out an Orville story, we're doing the best story that we can. And yes, we're pitching jokes and funny scenes, but we're really focused on telling a good science fiction story, you know. And some are goofier than others, some are more serious than others, and the variety of storytelling with featuring different characters was very important to him. And in fact, the network initially was getting frustrated with Seth because they wanted the episodes to be about Kelly and Ed,
Mm.
kind of like a Mad About You situation, you know, where they're the front and center. And he's like, no, there this is a show that's going to be a different kind of episode every week featuring different characters. Sometimes it won't be about Ed at all. And he stuck to that. He fought for and stuck to that vision.
Mhm. Well, and I think one of the things that works about the Orville is that that lineage of storytelling is definitely there, and you know, I'm so glad you guys are doing it. I'm looking forward to season 3. Um, and you know, with the Orville, um, I think fans should appreciate that it's almost like it's a part of this new, it's separate, right? Because it's not Star Trek, but I think it's a part of the kind of new golden age that we have going on right now. And I think where, you know, CBS All Access is able to do new and interesting things with Star Trek because they have an interesting home for it. And, you know, probably due to your relationship with Hulu, I think that that gives the Orville an opportunity to be part of that golden era, even if it's not in the same universe. It's a part of
Orville is,
storytelling.
you know, it owes its existence in some ways to Star Trek it's a legacy of science fiction that has always been around, in certainly in movies, and to a lesser degree in TV. You know, when Next Gen was on, it was in syndication, and it was hard to get people to take it seriously. I mean, we were nominated for Best Dramatic Series in season 7,
Mm.
which was a huge deal to get an Emmy nomination. That Emmy nomination, the big prize, and a David Kelly show called Picket Fences won.
Mm.
And great show, but people aren't watching reruns of Picket Fences. You know, I felt robbed.
Oh, that's true. All right. Well, uh, Brandon, I am so excited to be able to talk Star Trek with you.
It was
Uh,
fun.
it's in a different way as close to my heart as talking about Clive Barker and doing all those things. Star Trek to me um, is some of the first storytelling I remember watching the original series. So, you know, the whole evolution of it, and it's so much about, you know, I'm incredibly jealous that you got 17 years to like play with these toys and this toolbox. And I think um, even if people are not writing Star Trek, to look at the lessons that you guys learned through the years of writing Star Trek by you know, nailing down. I'm just working on a commentary episode about the original series episode Balance of Terror because I think it's the episode that where Star Trek became Star Trek. And one of the most important things is that that episode shows crew members who you don't even know, like running in the hallways, setting up things and doing things. And it's like that moment in Enterprise where they're looking at our star. I feel like it's little moments that writers can pull onto that, or that they can connect to, that make storytelling really work. And I just, my last question for you is for storytellers, whether they're talking about Star Trek or not, in your 17 years of working on Star Trek, what do you think was the most important lesson that you learned about storytelling from that you think you could have never gotten working on any other show, but just Star Trek? I know that's kind of a heavy one to end with.
Well, it's one of those ones I would have liked to have gotten ahead of time. It's hard to narrow it. It's almost impossible to say because it's in my DNA. Like I was so young and it was so formative. It's almost hard to answer. You know, narrowing it down to one thing. I think there was my answer to you would be to answer. I would have to fold it into the most common question I get about Star Trek, which is, why do you think it's so popular still? Why are we still talking about it? Why 30 years later? Why is it so popular around the world? And there's no easy answer to that either, but I would say, yes, it depicts a future that's optimistic, where we all want to be, where everyone has a place, no matter who you are, what culture you are, what color your skin is, whether you're a Borg or a Vulcan or whatever, everybody has a place. Yes, it's popular for that reason. But I think it's just that there was a level of excellence that was demanded in terms of the storytelling, even though we didn't always succeed and we would end up with a threshold. There was always an idea. There was something that we wanted to explore, an idea. And that really has stuck with me as an important, is one of those shows where you can just explore an idea. And that sounds kind of ridiculously reductionist and simplistic, like everything starts with an idea. But I think a Star Trek viewer will understand what that means. And the storytelling in Star Trek is just, it's been so consistently, and I'm not complimenting myself, I'm not meaning to do that. I was just one small part of it all. It's just been consistently good. Mm-hmm. You expect it. Balance of Terror. Well, it was the writing. Mm-hmm. That's the only variation, and it's the same actors, it's the same sets, it's the same directors, it's the same director of photography. The scripts, the writing in Star Trek is important. And the fact that you're talking to a writer from Star Trek right now instead of an actor is also a testament to that. And I think Twilight Zone was that way too. I don't know if all TV shows are that way. I think they are now more now. But
one thing, and since I have you and you work on the Orville and I did a commentary on here about the Twilight Zone and Star Trek. And one of the similarities is one of the lessons that I wish modern shows would take from Gene Roddenberry and Rod Serling is that they hired genre writers, right? I think the reason why the last two Twilight Zones failed, specifically the last one, it's all comedy writers that I understand Jordan Peele is going to writers he trusts. But the basis for the Twilight Zone has to be in dark literature. It's, the original series of Twilight Zone and the 80s Twilight Zone both were based on stories that were published previously in genre, and that's why they worked. And the original series of Star Trek hired A.E. Von Vogt and Norman Spinrad and Harlan Ellison to write episodes, even though they were heavily rewritten, but these were big names in science fiction. And I'm not saying that the modern shows need to hire these guys like they did in the past, but I like knowing that you're at the Orville because I know you're reading genre besides just, working in television. I know who Clive Barker is. I know who Stephen Graham Jones is. And just knowing that there's a writer there who knows genre I think is one of the reasons why that writer's room is creating stuff that's top notch, is because I know you're there.
Well, you're that's nice that you think that. Uh, I think it really Seth is, he no, I wish that I had known how well he could write this stuff, and I would have tried to steal him for Star Trek
Back in the day.
back in the day. But
Yeah, totally. No,
I,
his episodes are amazing.
oh, it's in his blood, man. Like, and it's also, you have, I mean, he's obviously, Seth is a genius, but he's also a Star Trek fan.
mm,
He knows why it works, and he knows what he likes about it and what he wants to see. And that's a good combination, and people, you have to be, and I agree about the genre thing, though there are some Family Guy writers in there, and it's a mix of people. He made sure that there were some Star Trek people in there.
yeah, and I'm not saying that they shouldn't be there, or that I just think the genre has to be represented. People who know and respect and understand the genre, in my opinion, makes the show better. And I think that's one of the mistakes of the last two incarnations of the Twilight Zone. Even though the one in the 2000s was staffed with tons of brilliant writers, they weren't adapting stories from the genre. And
we were also getting instructions from the network that were odd.
I'm sure too.
They really wanted it to be skew young. They didn't want older characters. And you watch the Twilight Zone, it's
it's real characters,
real people, and a lot of older characters. Burgess Meredith is in there. It's like you can't be limited that way. I haven't seen the new one. I keep meaning to watch it, but I just haven't.
Yeah, and there's some good episodes, but it's not. It doesn't have the Rod Serling feeling, in my opinion, and I think
it's missing Rod Serling. It would be like Black Mirror without Booker. There's a visionary behind Black Mirror, which I think is the best anthology show since the Twilight Zone. It's my humble opinion. I think a lot of people would agree.
Yes, I do too.
But Charlie Booker, someone could only come in and mimic what Booker's doing. Without Rod Serling, you'll never have the Twilight Zone. Not really. It was a particular sensibility that he brought to it, and an authenticity. A guy who went to war. It's like he was in World War II. He saw action. He saw things. He had this dichotomy of having grown up in a perfect little town and then saw the ugliness of humanity. And he came back, and it permeates everything about the Twilight Zone, his worldview and experience. You can't replicate that.
Mm-hmm. And that, I think, is a brilliant note. So
go eat your pizza.
Cosmos and the Orville. Where do we find all those?
Cosmos. Well, I don't know when this will air, but Cosmos is on Fox right now, Tuesdays at 8, and a whole new season, Cosmos Possible Worlds. Great season of Cosmos, and then it goes to Hulu the next day. So right now, I think you've got like half the season on Hulu, and then Orville will be. Books of Blood is on Hulu right now, the movie. Mm-hmm. And then Orville is going to come out next year sometime. They haven't announced one on Hulu.
Well, and on my other podcast, Postcards from a Dying World, we did a whole hour and change on the Books of Blood, and definitely recommend that movie to everybody. Super excellent example of writing and crafting a twisting, weaving narrative, and which is my sales pitch for the Books of Blood. So, Brannon, you have been really generous with your time. I'm sure Star Trek fans will be really excited to get your point of view. It's been a while since we've heard you talk about Star Trek, and we're just really excited about the Orville and can't wait for season 3.
Cool. Thanks for your time. Enjoy your pizza.